Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I have a really interesting author to introduce you to tonight with a interesting, provocative new book. Her name is Dr. Margaret Nowaczyk. She is a pediatric clinical geneticist, and she's written a book called Marrow Memory: Essays of Discovery. And in it, what Dr. Nowaczyk, is that correct?
Nowaczyk.
Nowaczyk, I apologize. Dr. Nowaczyk invites readers to examine her DNA under a microscope, sharing her vast life experiences in a series of invariably absorbing and beautifully crafted personal essays. From growing up in communist Poland to immigrating to Canada as a teen to working as a pediatric clinical geneticist and professor at McMaster University, Nowaczyk bears her soul while encouraging readers to explore the ways in which our experiences and identities are entangled with our ancestral history. Wow, this sounds really interesting. Tell me, why would a clinical geneticist, a pediatric clinical geneticist, want to write a book about her own DNA and examine her ancestral history?
Well, this is a collection of short essays that I have been working on for over 10 years. And they are, if you were unflattering, you would say they're scattered. If you were kind, you would say they are varied. They reflect many different parts of my life. As you said, growing up in communist Poland and listening to radio at night, trying to get the Western stations and getting some rock and roll, to remembering my peasant ancestors and writing about, how our DNA is shaped by memory, to something as simple as doing laundry during the pandemic or dyeing your hair when you reach a certain age. I combined my knowledge of sciences in many of those essays. For example, examining the different chemicals that produce a soup on top of my scalp to turn my hair not gray, to epigenetics, where experiences are written on top of our DNA, not in our DNA, but on top of our DNA, and how this might have shaped my experiences as a child. There's also a big essay where I do a longer essay where I sort of recount doing genealogy, because of the last 20 years I have been quite interested in my family's genealogy. And then there's essays about art, painting, sculpture, and a couple of essays that are much more personal, about my parents, discovering sexuality as a teenager. And then that's about it in a nutshell. It starts with an essay that is called You in Translation, which sort of depicts my earliest experiences with English and trying to find myself in a different language. So it is a smorgasbord.
A smorgasbord.
And to use yet another language, of my experiences over the last, I would say, 40 years,
And
which is
what's
my
the
life
mess?
in Canada.
What's the message? Is it a memoir? Does it have a message? What are you trying to say with this book?
Um, It really isn't a memoir. I have published a memoir. It came out 2.5 years ago, and it's called Chasing Zebras, which I would invite your listeners to maybe have a look at as well. This is just experiences from my life that I felt strongly enough to write about them. And the message is, you can always find beauty and interesting things in the most mundane things in your life if you look closely enough.
You can always find beauty even in the most mundane parts of your life if you look close enough.
Yes.
So is this like Slow Down and Smell the Roses?
And some of them, yes. Yes. And the other thing that I really enjoyed while writing those essays is combining my scientific knowledge with the everyday aspects of life.
So you've written 120 peer-reviewed papers in genetic journals, and you're a full professor at McMaster University as of 2014. And you're an advocate of something called, I'd like to understand this better, the narrative approach to medical care. So you've got really quite a fascinating and successful scientific background. Why would you want to write memoirs and smorgasbord essays of different mundane parts of your life?
Um, why would an artist want to write a painting? Paint a painting. Why would a poet want to write a poem? It was just an innate feeling. It was just an innate drive that I wanted to be a writer. I wanted to share my experiences, and I wanted to show how maybe how my brain works and put it in to the best of my ability, beautiful words.
I need to ask you, what is narrative medicine? And one of the reasons why, number one, I don't understand what it is, and so I'd be interested in understanding what it is. But number two, you had um, an acknowledgement written by a professor of narrative medicine that I was really intrigued by. Let me read it for everyone, if I could. Here is a physician who has answered the call to a perilous narrative life in the face of patients' illnesses and her own. To tell and to write, and the end is to see, however costly might be that sight. How fortunate are her patients and their families for her insight. How indebted is our field of narrative medicine to receive this moving testimony of the powers of shared creativity in our medicine and in our lives. Quote from Dr. Rita Sharon, the narrative medicine at Columbia University. What the heck is narrative medicine, and what are you doing to tell and to write, in the end to see, however costly that might be, that sight?
Well, this was a recommendation for my memoir, which is called Chasing Zebras, and Professor Sharon was kind enough and generous enough to recommend it. Um, Narrative medicine is a new approach to teaching medical students and residents and fellows, trainees in medical fields, to embrace the patient in his or her entirety. So not just concentrate on lab results, x-rays, CAT scans, and all of those kinds of printouts that we are inundated with now with modern medicine, but to look beyond them to the whole story of the patient, to the story of the patient's life. Because a patient coming into our office is not just, a thick stack of printouts and lab results. That person comes with a story. And their life story determines in many ways how they are going to respond to the medical encounter, how they're going to respond to therapies. Are they going to embrace therapies, or are they going to reject them? Are they going to listen to our advice? Are they going to just walk out the door and forget about them? So we have to understand the wholeness behind the person, and that constitutes their personal experiences, their lives experiences, their religion, their ethnicity, their, let's say, immigration history, learning a different language, whatever it is that that person has experienced, he or she brings to our encounter. And as physicians, we need to listen to them. And by listening, we pay attention to what Rita Sharon calls the text of the patient.
The text of the patient.
We read the text of the patient. We pay attention to the story of the patient. And that's what narrative medicine training is. The training constitutes reading literature and close reading with sort of, very close reading and analysis of literary texts in order to build empathy. Because while we read literary text, we vicariously can experience other people's experiences that we may not share in our lives. For example, you read you read Jane Eyre and you experience by reading good literary prose what it feels like to be a starving little girl in an abusive school. Or you read more modern things, you can the experiences of people with different backgrounds, refugees, gender fluid persons. So I don't have that in my own experience of life, but by reading good writing about them, I can get an understanding and a feeling for it. So reading literary prose is a mainstay of narrative medicine training. The other part is creative is writing, and both reflective writing and creative writing. And I have embraced the creative writing part of it wholeheartedly. But reflective writing is writing in non-medical language about a patient encounter by a healthcare professional. And while we're doing that, we can identify our own biases and our own preconceptions. We're not in the thick of the clinical encounter. We have the luxury of time and thought to identify even our own biases and identify what the patient brings. And when we understand ourselves better in that particular encounter, we can provide better care to the patient. And by listening to the patient better, we can also increase our diagnostic abilities and arrive at correct diagnosis faster and more meaningfully. That's in a nutshell narrative medicine.
Is empathy important for a physician?
Oh my goodness. Of course it is. And it is, you cannot be a good physician without empathy and trying to, there's a Polish saying that you have to eat a barrel of salt before you know somebody well, which is sort of akin to the English, you have to walk 1,000 miles in other person's shoes. And, when you have a 15-minute or a 5-minute encounter in clinic, you really have to be very attuned to the other person because you don't have the luxury of time to get to know them better. So empathy is imperative to good medical care.
What a fascinating conversation we're having today. We're going to take a break for some messages and be back in 2 minutes. And I'm going to ask the doctor, the author, to read something from her book to give us a sense of her writing. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Dr. Nowaczyk, who is a physician, an author, and an interesting person, is with us tonight. We're going to chat a little bit about her book. We're going to chat about her science. We're going to chat about her life because she's got a very interesting one. I've got to read to you the pitch that I got from her publicist because it really is quite interesting. I think Dr. Nowaczyk would be a fascinating local artist and scientist to interview. She was born in Poland in 1964 and immigrated to Canada with her family in 1981, having spent 6 months as a stateless person in Austria. She finished high school in Toronto in 1982, received a Bachelor of Science in Biochemistry in 85. She graduated with honors from the University of Toronto Faculty of Medicine in 1990. For 6 years, she trained in pediatrics and genetics at the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto with elective training at Boston Children's Hospital in pediatric neurology and at a hospital, Enfants Malades in Paris, in inborn errors of metabolism. Inborn errors of metabolism. We got to come back to that one. In 1997, she was offered a university faculty position as a clinical geneticist at McMaster Children's Hospital. Since then, she has been caring for children with genetic disorders and providing prenatal diagnostics and genetic counseling for adults. She has authored, as I mentioned already, over 120 peer-reviewed papers in genetic journals and rose to the rank of professor in 2015. She is a great advocate for that narrative approach to medical care. Unbelievable. What an incredible life story. I really want to read your book. What was it called about zebras?
Chasing Zebras.
I want to read your book, Chasing Zebras. That's your memoir of growing up in communist Poland, immigrating to Canada, working as a pediatric clinical geneticist, and now writing books that are a smorgasbord of essays about your life. Marrow Memory, Essays of Discovery, which is her most recent book. You said you might be able to read something from from Marrow Memory. Is that correct?
Yes.
Excellent.
I'm going to read the title essay, Marrow Memory. Jack and Luke, my sons, wade through the tangled shrubs, careful not to tread on the sunken graves of the old Brusna cemetery. Sandstone crosses appear within the underbrush, weather-beaten. Pale angels and ashen, sad-faced Madonnas peek between the tree trunks, hallowed with blossoms of reddish-orange moss. Footed in the greenery of the underbrush, they seem to float. A world secreted in the deep shadow of an old-growth beech forest in the southeastern corner of Poland. From the time our plane took off from Toronto Pearson International Airport 5 days earlier, my sons had complained incessantly about the bigos they would not touch, they gag at the smell of sauerkraut, about my speaking Polish to them. Excuse me, but I know what language I'm speaking. Not here, you don't. About the lousy cell phone coverage. When I try to shoot a photo of either of them, they pull faces or swat me away. On the first leg of a month-long tour of my homeland, we are visiting Horyniec, a town in the Polish-Ukrainian border where my grandmother was born in 1917. Not another cemetery, 10-year-old Luke moaned when I told him where we were going this morning. Jack scowled, as only a teenager can. You're crazy, Mama. Perhaps I am. I was bitten by a genealogy bug when on a microfilm at the Hamilton Family History Library, I located my grandfather's name in the 1908 baptism book from the now extinct Polish parish in Toporów. At that moment, I saw my grandfather, a tall, sinewy carpenter who had given me rides on his broad shoulders during Sunday walks, as a helpless 2-day-old newborn held over the baptismal font by his godparents. The distances and borders between me and that moment, the 94 years, the thousands of kilometers over 2 continents and 1 ocean, the 3 official languages, Polish, Latin, and English, disappeared. An unbroken chain led from that newborn to the newborn Luke I had recently brought home. From that on, I dug deeper, further into the past. It was not only the thrill of adding new names to the family tree that drove the search. Something more powerful, something unnameable, tugged at me across the chasms of time. Research has shown that DNA, the stuff genes are made of, can be modified as a result of lived experiences. Memories can be written not in the genes themselves, but onto them as epigenetic changes. Tiny 1-carbon methyl molecules attach to the DNA chain and influence the 3-dimensional coiling of the double helix. Like barnacles that cover the rungs of a ship's ladder and prevent you from getting purchase, the ladder is still there, its basic structure unchanged, but you cannot use it without scraping the shells off first. In that way, acquired elements may affect inheritance and nurture may affect nature. Such epigenetic transmission across 2 generations has been documented in cases of obesity and heart disease and trauma, even responses to smell, at least in laboratory mice. The hormone cortisone released during periods of physiological stress affects epigenetic modification. The methyl barnacles attach to the DNA and alter how genes can be accessed during a person's life. Is that why the whistle of a freight train filled me with dread as I lay in my safe bed late at night, hundreds of kilometers from where my ancestors' Jewish neighbors had been transferred to death camps? The English have a term for it, what's bred in the bone. I call it marrow memory. And then just a little bit later. A few days later, I zigzagged the rental car between foot-deep potholes on a road that looked like it had not been repaired since the fall of communism 20 years earlier. Luckily, there was no traffic, only an occasional horse-drawn wagon piled sky-high with hay. Mama, stop, Jack said suddenly. What's wrong? He wanted to go for a walk. The tall poplars that lined the road swayed in the breeze, their silver-bottomed leaves flittering like a school of fish. We ambled along the shoulder until we found a dirt path snaking into a field of wheat. It stretched at the green line over the trees on the horizon. The air smelled of wet hay and faintly of manure. Halfway down the path, Jack stopped. He inhaled deeply. Can you take a picture of me? He asked. What's that? He wanted a photo. I looked around. An unremarkable Polish countryside. Why here? I asked. He shrugged. I like it here. The sun on my back cast both our shadows on the green verge dotted with tall white flowers. His eyes scrunched up against the sun, his arms crossed over his chest in an awkward teenage stance. And yet my son looked like he belonged. And with a small tug in my chest, I realized that was exactly what I had been hoping for.
Beautiful. I've visited southeastern Poland
Oh, yeah?
and traveled around. I was married at the time to someone of Polish descent, and we went to a town that I guess had been Ukrainian had been Polish, had been Ukrainian had been Polish as the borders moved back and forth. About half the town was of Ukrainian descent, about half the town was of Polish descent, and we met a fascinating gentleman, a cousin who was the former chief of police who was studying genealogy because he was amazed at how his town, I think it was called Lublin, had half of the town and its descendants disappear during World War
Yes.
II. And he
Yes.
wanted to understand, how the town had developed as a combined Polish Jewish town and had changed completely. And it was really quite
Yes.
fascinating. The other vivid memory I have of the town is on the street at about 4:30 or something like that in the afternoon, and all the cattle and the horses and the goats and whatever else was coming back from the fields, rush hour on the street as they peeled off and knew exactly which farm they were going to go to get the food that they were going to get that evening for their evening. But they all went out to a common farmland, common pasture, and came back in. It was fascinating. I got to ask you about your epigenetics. I've heard about intergenerational trauma, and I always thought intergenerational trauma was socialized. What you're saying is it's actually somehow written on top of the DNA?
That's a theory. And we do know that epigenetic changes, the barnacles that I was explaining attached to the ladder of the DNA, so DNA is passed from generation to generation, and it goes through what is called meiosis to produce gametes, eggs and sperm. And sometimes when the DNA is divided between eggs and sperm, the epigenetic changes become incorporated into the DNA. So originally they're just like barnacles on top of the ladder, which you can scrape off and get at the DNA. But when the DNA goes through meiosis, sometimes some of the changes, not all of them, get incorporated to become actually genetic information. They're small little molecules of one carbon or two carbon molecules that then they enter the DNA and they can change the genetic code itself. Most of the studies for this have been the studies of the Dutch famine during World War II and the effects of the Dutch famine on pregnant women so women who experienced famine while they were pregnant and the results of that on their children and predisposition to obesity and diabetes. And then that gets passed on onto the next generation. And the other very interesting thing, which is sort of trying to understand my feelings, the woman's eggs start dividing. They enter the first part of meiosis when she is a fetus. So if my mother was born in 41, her eggs were dividing in 1941 during the war. And one of those eggs became me in 1964, and now here in 2024. So whatever happened epigenetically to the eggs that my mother was dividing as a fetus in 41, whatever the stresses were going on, starvation, the exposure to the human trauma and all of that, I have a theory that has been written in in the egg that became me many years later. That's how I understand it. That's how I sort of explain it to myself.
So this is fascinating. You're saying that the eggs in a female start dividing when that female is actually not even born yet.
That's right. That's the
And
first division. And the second division happens just before ovulation, so 2 weeks before fertilization. So eggs, female eggs are actually in suspended animation for the whole duration. It's we can talk about it for hours, but that's what happens.
sorry, say that again. So before fertilization, uh,
So
so
so an egg
so
starts dividing when the woman is a fetus,
yeah, and
and then it
divides
goes in, it
and
divides the first time,
just once.
just once. It has to undergo two divisions to produce gametes. It's just a special type of division that's called meiosis. So the first part of it happens when she's a fetus, and then those eggs sit in suspended animation until the woman ovulates 20, 30, 40 years later. When the egg undergoes the second part of the meiosis division, and then she ovulates, and that egg is fertilized, and that gives rise to the baby.
How many eggs does a female have?
Thousands. She doesn't use them all up during her life.
And if they divide that second time, and yet they're not fertilized, what happens to them?
Well, the woman menstruates.
And then when one gets older and goes through menopause, what happens to the eggs that are
They
remaining
just they just kind of die off.
and stay in the body
Yeah.
or somehow
Yeah,
leave the
no, they
body?
just stay in the ovary, and the ovary just kind of gets shriveled up.
Hmm. And how would these eggs that are dividing during the time that the mother is still in the fetus actually somehow create a memory?
Because as they are dividing, the barnacles are attaching to them. And the barnacles can be affected by stress hormones in that fetus's mother. Let's say she's starving because there's not enough food during the war. So she's under stress. There's high level of cortisol in her body, the stress hormone, and that affects how the epigenetic barnacles attach to the DNA of the dividing fetus.
So I've read articles, maybe not as scientific as your Dutch famine that you talked about, but that generations later of people that were in concentration camps, for an example, that they treated food differently, that they had different reactions to maybe it was your comment about the train whistle or something like that. So you actually think that's possible that somehow the memory of something traumatic that happened, a
Yes,
generation or two ago actually is somehow impacting people's genetics.
yes, that's what it is.
So I
Now,
had an interesting
we cannot
conversation. Go ahead. I apologize.
we cannot dismiss the psychological effects of it as well, not the true epigenetic, changes at the biochemical level. The psychological effects are also very, very important for intergenerational trauma.
So that, I guess, was what I was going to ask. I ended up having a really interesting conversation with someone whose grandmother was in an abusive relationship, whose mother was in an abusive relationship, and she found that she was always looking for men that would, she thought, treat her abusively, and she thought that was socialization. Is it socialization, or is it genetics, or is it some combination of it?
It's probably a combination. Some of these things are very difficult to tease apart to figure what's what and what, to what extent socialization, psychology, and then the actual true biochemistry affects that. There's a lot of work going on in that, but we're still pretty far from understanding exactly how it happens.
So I guess the importance of the question is that if it's psychological, and we're talking about what she described as intergenerational trauma, one could through therapy solve that and
That's
and
right.
alleviate it. But if it's in your genetics, can you ever solve it and alleviate it?
You learn how to live with it, I would say. Again, through therapy and other things, because you know, the genes that we're talking about are not, there may not be genes about how the body is put together, but how the body responds to trauma. And those things can be relearned and rewired.
What a fascinating conversation. Remind us again, please, the name of your memoir
The memoir is called Chasing Zebras,
and your current book,
Marrow Memory.
and where can people get it or get
Um,
them?
Indigo, your independent local bookstore. And if you must, you can also buy it from Amazon.
If you must. We're going to take a break and come back and chat a little bit about the experience of leaving communist Poland and being a stateless person in Austria and then being an incredible success in Canada. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is a best-selling Polish-Canadian author and pediatric clinical geneticist, Dr. Margaret Nowaczyk. And she's recently released a book, Marrow Memory, Essays of Discovery. She's previously written about her own life in a memoir called Chasing Zebras. Is that correct?
That's right.
And she's also written 120 peer-reviewed articles, papers in genetic journals. We're not going to talk about those, though, frankly, I could be really fascinated by learning a little bit more about them. You've got an interesting, if not fascinating, background. You grew up in communist Poland. You were a stateless person in Austria, and then you came to Canada, and then you ended up becoming an incredibly successful and important academic, and now an author. Tell me, did you know English when you came to Canada?
I oh yes and no is probably the best answer. I studied English, so to speak, since grade one as an extracurricular activity, and then in high school for 2 years I was in it wasn't English immersion, but as they called it, extended program of teaching English. So for 2 years I had 7 hours of English and a week. But what I learned when I landed in Canada was that my passive knowledge of English was pretty good. I could understand and I could read. I could understand spoken language. I could read. But when it came to actually producing English, I was functionally mute, and it was extremely stressful. All of a sudden, from being a very gregarious person who loved to talk and make jokes, I was gagged. I felt like I was gagged, and it took a good 2 years to start finding my way. Of course, I could communicate at the basic level, but not at the level that I was used to. And it was very, very stressful.
And you were still in high school at the time. You're still a
Yes, I
teenager.
was 16 when I arrived in Canada.
Um, in 1981, when you came, I had a former cousin-in-law that emigrated at the time. It was, I understood, very difficult to emigrate, and the only way you would is if you were part of Solidarity and got kicked out. Why were you allowed to leave, or how did you leave Poland?
We, in terms of the time, we left at the time when Solidarity was just starting, but we did not leave because of it. We were actually supposed to have left the year before. Illegally, of course. Illegal immigration was not a thing in Poland. There were very few instances of legal immigration. It was, if somebody married a foreigner, for example, they were allowed to leave legally, but you couldn't just up and leave. So my parents had applied for a passport. You had to apply for a passport for the whole family, and basically those were rejected out of hand. But because my father had traveled to Canada on a business trip 3 times and 3 times returned, the powers that be deemed us safe and not a flight risk, and the whole family got passports to go officially for a holiday to Greece, which was at the time, which was part of the West, and you needed a passport. Within the Eastern Bloc, you didn't need a passport to travel. And then the whole family were granted passports, and then my mother got sick in 79, so we didn't even pick up the passport. So at that time they decided, oh, of course they're not a flight risk because they would have been gone by now. So we got them again the year later, at which point we packed up all of our belongings that we could into a Fiat 125 and left. officially going to Greece, but we stopped in Austria, and that was the end of our trip. Registered at refugees at the UN run refugee center, and we stayed there for 6 months while the Canadian bureaucracy slowly worked through our application.
And then came to Toronto.
Yes, then we flew from Toronto, Vienna via Zurich to Toronto in March 81.
And as I mentioned, I've been in southeastern Poland, and if your father was a businessman traveling to Canada, he was obviously of a different sort of state than my impressions. But I toured. I think it was in '93 or something like that, through that part of southeastern Poland before the fall of the Berlin Wall, and it was like I was traveling back 50 or 100 years
Yeah.
in life. The houses, the cars, the shops were shockingly primitive.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so someone coming from that kind of an environment, and I went through Krakow. Krakow was beautiful, but Krakow similarly was still, extremely primitive. We drove to Warsaw on a road where we had to pull to the other side to allow someone, old babushka lady pulling a wagon to continue along her way. I was shocked at how primitive it was. I returned, I think, 10 years later, and was equally amazed at the modernization that had taken place in the interim time period. But for someone coming from that kind of an environment to rise to being such a renowned scientist and clinical geneticist and professor, how'd you do that?
Well, I apparently I told my parents when I was 5 that I wanted to be a doctor. So ever since then, everything that was, my life was subjugated to that desire. Now, my parents were both engineers, so there was never a question about, whether I'm going to go to university, but what university I'm going to go to. So that was a given that I would go to university. Then there was, of course, the hurdle of getting into medical school, and then I discovered that I really liked studying and science, and so I stayed in academia, and genetics became my obsession is not a good word, but it was. In first year medical school, first year medical school, when we had no second, anyway, at the first year medical school, when we had genetics, and it was phenomenal. I mean, I was just completely smitten with the possibilities and the intricacies of genetics, and it combined two things that I really loved, which was biochemistry and pediatrics. So it was sort of a tailor-made field for me, and I just ran with it.
You're a pediatric clinical geneticist. Tell me, why do we have these issues with people that are born, kids that are born? Is it mutations? Is it something that went wrong? Give us a little quick review of why we end up having issues.
There are two main mechanisms for, children being born with differences. One is a genetic difference in the DNA code, um, variations in the genetic code. In the olden days, it used to be called mutations, but because it had acquired a negative connotation, we call it variations that cause differences in development of organs or the brain. And that can be either inherited from the parents who are carriers for that condition, or it can occur as a new change. When the gametes are forming, the DNA is divided. And every time DNA is divided, there are little mistakes can creep in. 99% of the time, the body, there's actually a proofreading mechanism for DNA. So it scans the DNA to make sure that it's um, um, translated, that it's copied correctly, but sometimes things slip through. Now, when mistakes slip through, 90% of the time they are benign, they're neutral. 5% of the time they cause disease, and 5% of the time they cause an improvement. And that's the basis for evolution. That's how we got bigger brains and opposable thumbs. So DNA change in itself is not bad. It's just sometimes it happens that it causes disease. So that's one thing. And the other mechanism for children being born with differences is exposures to what we call teratogenic agents, mother's illness, alcohol, drugs, those kinds of things. So those would be the main mechanisms for the happening of babies with inborn differences.
You provide, this says, prenatal diagnosis and genetic counseling. I presume that's for people that you've done ultrasounds on or things like that, that you identify genetic disorders with?
That's right. So so there are, again, two broad categories. One is patients with family history of genetic diseases. So we know that there's a disease that runs in the family, and we can offer testing of the fetus for that condition. Or the other one is unexpected findings on the ultrasounds when there's a difference that we discover, a baby's missing a hand or a baby has a heart defect. And that's when the geneticist is called.
And what do you do with the counseling? And maybe I'm getting political here, but last Thursday we had the debate between former President Trump and President Biden about abortion, and I think it's a large issue. But I think most parents get ultrasounds and get information about their babies. How do you feel about abortion?
I think abortion is a right, and I know, and we're very fortunate in Canada that we do not have to deal with politicians who think they know better than the woman herself about her body. We have, it's abortion is freely available, and in instances when we're looking at a deadly kind of a condition in the baby, I don't think anybody else should be telling the parents what to do.
Thank you for joining us. I really appreciate it. This has been a fascinating conversation.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Remind us again the names of your books and where one can go get them.
My memoir about my life as a geneticist is called Chasing Zebras, and my collection of essays is called Marrow Memory. You can purchase them in Indigos, in your independent bookstore, or if you must, Amazon also carries both of them.
I really appreciate the opportunity to chat with you. It's been very enlightening. I've learned something about genetics. I've learned something about Marrow memory. I thought that the ideas that you talked about in regards to the way that issues can get attached to DNA is fascinating, and the comparison between that and sort of socialization or psychological or sociological sort of changes is interesting. And your story about coming from Poland and being this incredible success in Canada is inspirational. And your narrative, medicine, and growing empathy or building empathy is I think, is really encouraging. I went to a fascinating speech once where one of the keynote speakers said that we don't have enough empathy, we don't have enough emotional intelligence, we don't have enough appreciation for the challenges that other people have in their lives. And the best way to get that is through reading fiction, and said much the same as what you're describing. And this was for business people, and encouraging business people to read fiction, not just nonfiction, but to read fiction so that we all could build empathy and understanding and appreciation for the challenges that other people experience in their lives. And so therefore we could become more empathetic, and we could have greater emotional intelligence and build better cultures within our organizations and within our communities. And so what an interesting array of different topics we've discussed today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 p.m. on 960 a.m. You can stream me online, even from Hamilton, at www.saga960am.ca. All my podcasts and videos go up on my website, briancrombie.com, and on social media as soon as the show goes to air. Good night, everybody.